Hello and welcome to the first session of CJ 520 Policing. The first chapter is written by the editors and it introduces the basic behavior and expectations of police in our society today. And the authors write that the police are in a situation where they are expected to represent the government as well as help enforce laws in order to guarantee desired behavior from everyone. And they divide police control into four major elements: authority, power, persuasion, and force. And they do a very good job of going into that, so I'm not going to provide examples or define those concepts, but all of those elements function in part because of the underlying threat of force. And laws hold societies together. Without the enforcement of laws, they would be useless. And so police are used to enforce those laws in an attempt to create an effective and an efficient society. And throughout the chapter, the authors discuss how people view the police, what role do they play. Generally speaking, most people do display a high degree of confidence in the police, although this does vary according to the authors. This variance can be based on age, race, political beliefs, and other characteristics. So I've got a few major points that I want you to take away from this. I think the social contract theory, some of the basic arguments for and against are important, and also the typical work environment for most officers in the U.S. If you've read the chapter, you may have been surprised. If you haven't, you probably will be when you read what it's like. We have a very decentralized system here in the United States, whereas in Japan it's very, very centralized, but we have thousands of different police agencies throughout the U.S. Chapter 2 is a very important chapter. It's titled The Development of the American Police, and it divides the history of law enforcement into 8 separate parts, beginning first with colonial America and then continuing up until the present day. And Part 1 looks at America's heritage of English law enforcement and how America then adapted it to form an institution that reflected American values and beliefs. I think it's a very important a very important part of this chapter. And then Part 2 focuses on the struggles of American urban areas during the 18th and 19th centuries. And during this time period, it became imperative to create full-time law enforcement staff. And there was some resistance to this because Americans had just broken away from the British, and they were very leery of full-time law enforcement officers. In fact, for a long time, the officers weren't even allowed to wear uniforms. Just giving them uniforms was seen as being a potential attack on civil liberties. Part 3 examines the 19th century American cities in particular. It also mentions officer corruption, even though it was certainly around before then and afterwards. Part 4 looks at the first reform movement between 1890 and 1920. And as a small part of the sweeping progressive era, law enforcement was also a target for change and improvement. And the author goes into this in a little more detail. Part 5 looks at the second reform movement between 1910 and 1960, and it explains during this time period police chiefs and other leaders worked to professionalize law enforcement officers. Requiring a college degree was something that you started to see in some areas of the country. And Part 6 examines the numerous riots of the 1960s and how the containment of these riots affected policing across the country. And Part 7 looks at the long-term legacy of the 1960s and its effects on policing. And then the last part is Part 8. I told you this is a long chapter, which looks at that third the third reform movement in policing, and this occurred during the 1980s and the 1960s. So it's very straightforward, but I would kind of read that one carefully because it is important to know the history, and that's something that you could see again on one of the exams. Chapter 3. This is actually written by a friend of mine, John Worrell, and he's very much interested in quantitative data analysis, which involves a lot of statistics, and because of that, part of the chapter is difficult to read and understand, especially if you haven't had statistics or research methods yet. But I think that it does a fairly good job of summarizing what we as researchers have learned throughout the most recent decades concerning the correlation between policing and crime. And it focuses on numerous data inputs in order to create a reliable synopsis. And one of the things he talks about is the need to focus time on securing grants to meet the department's financial needs. And because of this, some people say, well, is crime, if you're doing this, well, you're not making crime the foremost concern. And so if it's not the foremost concern, how can we expect our nation's law enforcement agencies to combat crime? And I think it's a fair question. He also talks about the limitations of patrolling. Of particular interest is the Kansas City Patrol Experiment. This is something that I would definitely read about. He doesn't write too much about it, but I would definitely read what he has written. And while there are limitations of this study, it shows the mere presence of police is necessary. It serves a symbolic function. But having said that, patrolling in and of itself does not always deter illegal acts. And a lot of this could be because not all illegal acts take place out on the streets where police are. Sometimes they're domestic violence, which are inside of the house, where police are seldom granted authority to go. Chapter 7 is also written, the first author is written by a friend of mine, Wesley Jennings, and I don't know the second gentleman, but this is the police response to persons with mental illness, which is a huge topic right now. And it illustrates the significant impact that deinstitutionalization has had on the ability to treat the mentally ill, along with the responsibilities of law enforcement to these individuals. There's a lack of services right now, which has had quite an impact. The authors acknowledge that there is an argument against training, at least training police officers too much with knowing mental illness, because some police officers could become street corner or dime psychologists. Having said that, though, training is so important, and it's very important for that police officer or even the corrections officer to know about mental illness, because mentally ill individuals, they're often labeled as criminal in the same way as someone who's not mentally ill to a certain degree, but the actions of the mentally ill individual cannot be held to that same standard as those who are not mentally ill. And it's very, very difficult, and I think police have a real challenge right now, and corrections for that matter. Some aspects that I want you to look at, they allude briefly to the role of electronic energy devices like tasers and stun guns and in subduing mentally ill individuals. This is a very good research area right now, and it's one that I've been fortunate enough to have been involved in on a couple of occasions. And that is a very important discussion. And it actually leads us very nicely to our last article that you needed to read, talking, about electronic energy devices and stun guns. Well, that takes us now to use of force policy in training. And the author essentially says that it's a major challenge for law enforcement leaders to make the use of force in their agencies as efficient as possible. And there are three important things that are crucial to success, and these are a sound policy, being able to enforce that policy, and then of course training. You have to have quality training. And modern day policies are extremely detailed, and they restrict the ability of police to use force against individuals. And so individuals and scholars have debated, specific policies, including the use of force against moving vehicles or drawing and pointing firearms. And the goal here is to avoid unnecessary force whenever possible. Another element of change that has been seen is in the promotion of policies that measure police accountability in the use of force. The author writes, most departments require documentation of officers' use of force, although agencies vary in the types of force that must be reported. I think absolutely everything should be reported, without question. Another interesting issue, this is something that came up in the management of criminal justice class that we had last semester with a couple of you were in it, more than a couple actually. What do you do with an officer who's been involved in a deadly use of force, especially if it's questionable circumstances and he or she could become a suspect, the person that you might be charging? Should they be allowed to talk with an attorney? Not an issue that the author talks about here, but still one that's very important. And she also talks about how police training has advanced in numerous ways. Police no longer shoot they don't shoot at targets that are 60 feet away anymore. Now they participate in technologically advanced, very, very realistic types of simulations where they have to use their judgment and their skills. Also, they're being taught, occasionally you can use verbal intervention and not have to use a use of force, although that's rare, but those verbal techniques are still important. And finally, despite the advances within the law enforcement profession, police executives are still struggling with the use of force policy, and I have a few more issues that I'd like for you to look at. And that's about it, really, for all of these chapters. Of course, you definitely want to read everything. And if you have questions, if you look like that guy there and you just don't understand or you need me to clarify something, don't hesitate to email me, and I'd be happy to do that. All right, well, that's it, and I'll be looking forward to reading your comments.